Before we move forward in the Sermon on the Mount, I want to go back to the beginning, to where this started. And let's put ourselves in the place of the disciples that are following Jesus. This crowd has started to gather behind us as we're walking, and maybe Jesus is just talking. Maybe it's just some casual talk between us and him, and we're wondering where we're going and what's going to happen for the rest of the day and what the plans are ahead. And we're following him as he's talking. But at some point, we get to this mount, and Jesus turns around, and he stops, and he sits. And he's looking at us. Now, this is different because this isn't what rabbis do. Rabbis stand and students sit. But our teacher, our rabbi, he has sat. And he's looking at us. And he begins with telling us who is blessed. And he tells us 8 different attributes, characteristics of what it means to be blessed. And he starts by telling us that those that are broken in spirit, and those who mourn, and the blessed are the meek, and the blessed are the ones who hunger and thirst for righteousness. The blessed are the ones who show mercy. The blessed are the ones who are peacemakers. And then he tells us that the blessed are also the ones that are persecuted. And maybe he pauses for just a second, because you and I are just trying to figure out what this means. Because I hear these words and I'm encouraged that Jesus is telling us that God blesses us and those who do or are these things, that he sees us when we're showing mercy and we're being peacemakers, when our spirit's been broken, when we mourn over our sin, when we hunger and thirst for that which is right that comes from him. I'm encouraged by it. But at the same time, I'm a little discouraged, because the reality of my life tells me that I'm not those things all the time. And sometimes I'm better. Some days are good. But other times I'm not doing so well. And I know that God blesses. He just told us that God blesses us when we show mercy. But I find myself in situations where I want somebody to hurt. I want them to feel the pain that they've caused me. Sometimes I know I'm supposed to be a peacemaker, but my anger starts a war. And I start to wonder, is Jesus talking to the wrong person? Am I not qualified? You're wondering the same things. Is Jesus looking for somebody who can do all these things all the time? And I believe that Jesus sees this. And he looks us in the eye as we're standing there. And he says, you are the salt of the earth. And we hear these words. And today they may not have the significance that they had then. But this is where he goes. And he tells us, and he told them, that you are the salt of the earth. And he talks about salt losing its flavor. Can salt lose its flavor? And if it did, can it be restored? But then he answers the question that he's already asked, and he says, it will be thrown out. This salt that has lost its saltiness will be thrown out and trampled underfoot as worthless. That means something to us, because in that time, in that place, in that context, salt was valuable. It was rare. It was a rare commodity. People needed it. We still need salt. They really needed salt. It was valuable. Salt was something that was used as a currency. Salt was so prized that wars were fought over salt. To invite somebody to your home and to salt the dish that you've given them over a meal, to salt their meal, was a sign of hospitality. It was a bond that had been formed. It was signified by me or you salting another person's plate. We may not know this, but in Leviticus it tells us that God required all the grain offerings to have salt added to them. If the offering didn't have salt, it was unacceptable to God. Salt had significance not only to the daily lives of the people, but also with God. They saw salt as something of purity. It was white, still is, but a sign of purity. But it couldn't be destroyed, not even by fire. So when we would sign a covenant or with God, with this offering, this salt had this significance of how strong this agreement was, that it wouldn't be destroyed. So when Jesus looks at you and I and that crowd and he says, you are the salt, he's telling us that we are valuable, that we are rare, we are needed, we are important. And keep in mind that the two uses of salt still today that we're familiar with is, one, it preserves. They didn't have refrigerators and freezers back then like we do now. So if meat and certain foods, fish, were to be preserved, they would have to salt them down. Still used today. You can buy cured meat. Salt is still a preservative. Salt also enhances flavor. That's why it's on every table in every restaurant. We probably all have one of these or multiple of these in our homes, right? This is a what? A salt shaker. It enhances flavor. So when Jesus says, you are the salt of the earth, it has significance. It still has significance to us. But notice how he says this. The first two words are, you are. This is indicative. This is a statement of fact. This is not a recommendation. This isn't a suggestion. Jesus didn't say, you can be, you might be, you should be. He says, you are. He's talking to his followers, those who have put their faith in him. He's talking to us, those of us that have put our faith in him. He says, you are. He's not telling us what we should do. He's telling us who we are. This is who we are. And it's very personal. He didn't say they when he was talking to a group, which he was. He said you. He was talking to them individually. He's talking to us individually when he says, you are the salt of the earth. That you have this significance, this importance, that you're a rare commodity, that you are needed, that you serve a purpose. There is a function to your being that's greater than survival. There's a plan and a purpose for your life. You are the salt of the earth. But then he asks these two questions. He says, what good is salt if it's lost its flavor? And can you make it salty again? Now, if we're listening to Jesus, and maybe we thought this and think this now when we hear it, is Jesus this rabbi, this teacher who's giving us this lesson? He's already given us a test. There's already a pop quiz, and we're only a few minutes into this talk. And he wants to know, what good is salt if it's lost its flavor? Well, the truth is, salt doesn't lose its flavor. Salt is salt. Salt, even if it's left unused for extended, long periods of time, is still salty. So how can salt lose its flavor? Because this is the question that Jesus is ultimately asking, and then answers what should be done to salt salt that's lost its flavor, salt that's lost its saltiness. Can you make it salty again? So he's asking a question, but drawing the assumption that there is salt that has lost its saltiness. And how does it happen, and how do we deal with it? So we take this. You've already told me what it is. It's a salt shaker. And we know what's inside it, right? Salt. But how do we know that? How do we know this is salt? How do you know this is salt? We make the assumption because we're familiar with the container, right? We don't have to be told when we see this on a table, oh, there's salt in that one. We just know. And then we use it accordingly as we want to. But it's the container that tells us that it's salt. But what about just the look of it? If it wasn't in this container, would we know it was salt? Probably, right? Depending on where it is, we would know. Somebody doesn't have to tell us what salt looks like when it's out on a sidewalk or on a road. We know. We can tell by the way it looks. But Jesus is asking, can salt lose its flavor? And can salt be resalted? Can it be made salty again? Which tells us that there's situations, there are times maybe and places and really people who look like salt but have lost their saltiness, their ability to be salt. I think the warning is this: we can't assume that based on a container, an environment, that this is salt. And we can't assume, based on an environment or a place, that the people who gather are his followers. And Jesus warns us to watch out for sheep and wolves in sheep's clothing. Right? We can be deceived. Something may look like something that it's really not. You don't know if this is really salt. This could be sugar. They look very similar. It would be hard to tell them apart with the naked eye. But this might be sugar. How would you know it's sugar and not salt? When you sprinkled it on whatever you wanted salted. It's not salty. The flavor hasn't been enhanced. The flavor's been sweetened with sugar. So maybe what we think is salt isn't really salt at all. So it never had saltiness because it was never salt to begin with. It just looked like it. But the other side of this is, what about, and this happened, and it still happens today, but not necessarily with salt because it's not traded and it doesn't have the value that it had then in the marketplace. But there were deceitful sellers in the market who would cut their salt with sugar. They would compromise it. They would take away the integrity of it. We would think we're buying and paying for this rare, valuable commodity and believe we're getting salt. It looks like salt, but it's been cut with sugar. And we wouldn't know that until we tried to use it. The proof will be in what it does. Does what I believe to be salt do what salt does? And in that time and place, it would be preserve meat and enhance flavor. And if we bought salt that had been mixed, had been compromised, the integrity of it had been altered and changed, we would know that when the meat we were preserving didn't preserve the right way. And the flavor we wanted to enhance didn't give us the flavor that we desired because it wasn't pure salt. So we can't make the assumption that what we see is salt based on what we see, because we can be deceived. But we also shouldn't pretend either. We shouldn't pretend to be salt when we're not. And some of us have got this down pat, right? Maybe nobody in this room, but we've all experienced this. People who look like a follower of Jesus, but what we see in their life, the outcomes are very different than what they should be. They've been compromised. They've allowed the influence of the world to change them. And they look a certain way, but what they're producing is not what salt would produce. So what happens when salt's been compromised, when the integrity's been broken down, or it's not salt at all? Well, Jesus says it should be thrown out and trampled underfoot as worthless. It doesn't have value. Looking like salt isn't salt. And the value of salt is its saltiness and being able to do what only salt can do. He says you could throw it back out on the ground. In essence, just put it back where it came from. Because salt, right, is mind. It just, water and the sun, it just evaporates water and salt is left. And we've come up with technology and different ways to mine salt now that they didn't have. But the most simple form of getting it is just wait till the water evaporates. So just throw it back out. It'll make its way because it doesn't have any value. The value of salt is in its saltiness. It's in doing what it's supposed to do. And this is how Jesus describes his followers. In essence, he's saying this is the influence, because this is what salt does. Salt changes things. See, salt in the shaker only has potential. There's only potential here. Until it comes out of the shaker, it doesn't do anything. We have to be careful that a gathering like this isn't, in our minds, the end of our existence together. That this is it. This is what we do. This is what God's body, this is what God's people do. They come together. We are salt. But right now, we are in the shaker. And all we have is a whole lot of potential. But the power of the salt is in its purity and its presence. In that it hasn't been compromised. The integrity is still there. What we think it is, what we see, and what we expect are true. That we present ourselves accurately. But it's the presence of salt. Salt doesn't need to do anything. We don't have to turn salt on. You don't have to activate it. You just have to use it. Just shake it out. Put it on a plate. Put it on some raw meat. Put it on your icy driveway. Salt does what salt does. It's what it is. It preserves, it enhances flavor. That's what salt does. And this is how Jesus describes us. This is who he says. This is your identity. You are the salt of the earth. So what does that mean? Because salt, its number one use was to preserve something. To take a piece of meat and stop it from rotting. That's what salt did and does. But in that time and in that place and in that setting, that's what made salt so valuable. That they could buy meat, they could harvest meat, they could fish, and they wouldn't have to eat it all right now. That they could salt it, they could preserve it, and they could plan and prepare for the future. That they have a meal for tomorrow and next week. They could build an inventory. We do this. We have pantries and cupboards and refrigerators full of food that we're not going to eat all today. Hopefully not. But they didn't have that luxury. So salt stops decay just by being salt. Sprinkle salt on raw meat and it dehydrates it. It takes the water out of it. All living things, organisms, need water to survive. What is on a piece of raw meat? Bacteria. If we leave it go, that bacteria will grow and we will watch decomposition happen. It will start to smell. We will see the evidence of aging in meat. We've all seen this. But salt stops decay. It extracts the water that those microbes need. It upsets the balance of these harmful bacteria and microbes, these disease-causing agents, by reducing the water pressure on the outside. This is a little science for you. I had to look all this up. And the difference in the internal to the external pressure in these disease-causing microbes is changed and they rupture. And that's how decay and decomposition stops with salt. That's how it works. That's how it preserves. And Jesus says, you are the salt of the world. Which tells us that the world around us is decaying. It's spiritually dead. It's decomposing. That's not some made-up statement. We know this. We see it happening around us. We could go back to Genesis. Adam and Eve broke the rule. God said, you have all of this, but don't touch that one. Eve bought a lie. Adam participates in the taking of the fruit. And sin is introduced into the DNA of mankind. And every person born after them has been infected with it. But one generation, their two sons, one murders the other. Moral decay. Things will continually get worse if something doesn't stop it. We live in a society that is morally decaying. It's spiritually dead. We can watch crime rates increase. We see divorces increase. We see violence increase. We see hopelessness increase. We see despair increase. We see addictions increase. We see suicides increase. All of this because of social decay. And the solution is you and I. You are the salt of the earth. Our purpose is preservation. To stop the decomposition. And what do we need to do that? Because that seems like a mighty big task. Just be the salt. Just be the people, the person that God has called you to be. Salt doesn't need to be activated. Doesn't need anything added to it. It just does what salt does. Jesus is telling us, just be a believer of mine. Just be a disciple. Just be a follower. Just be you, following me. And the impact you'll have is one of preservation, to stop the moral decay around you. Let me read you a quote from John Stott, because I think this sums it up so well. And when society goes bad, we Christians tend to throw up our hands in pious horror and reproach the non-Christian world. We blame them for being bad. But should we not rather reproach ourselves? One can hardly blame unsalted meat for going bad. Unsalted meat, dead meat, will decay. That's what it does. It cannot do anything else. That's all it can do. The real question to ask is, where is the salt? So I ask that question to you. Where is the salt? It's easy to look around, and we're in some times right now that are just unprecedented. And I hate the word unprecedented because we hear it so much. But it's true. We're experiencing things right now that we haven't experienced before. We're in the middle of a pandemic. Hopefully we're near the end of a pandemic. We're way past the middle of. But all of what that's brought to our lives, the political environment that we live in right now, right? It's just crazy. And people are asking, what am I supposed to do? What are we supposed to do? What's the church supposed to do? What are Christians supposed to do? The question is, what am I supposed to do? Jesus says, be the salt. Just be the salt. This moral decay is very visible around us. The answer is to stop the decomposition. The answer is salt. So where is the salt? It's right here. It's us. And that's the challenge that we have, is to see what's happening around us and not to blame dead meat for decomposition. That's what it does. The solution, the answer is in us. Just be salt. Wherever we are, we got to get out of the shaker. You know what happens to a human body when it doesn't get rid of salt? Our bodies naturally get rid of salt through perspiration, tears. If a body retains salt, it gets bloated and unhealthy. It gets sick. Same thing is true with the body of Christ. If it's all about being contained, staying safe within our four walls, staying away from what's stinky outside, we will get bloated and unhealthy. Salt is made to be spread, shared, used. Its power is in the presence. Just realize where you're at and how God's using you. And focus on being the salt. We'll see if society doesn't stop its moral decay, this slide that it's on, further and further away from God. That's our purpose. It's what we look like in the world. Next week, Jesus gives another example. He says, you are the light. And what does that mean to us? But it means something significant. But for right now, for today, let us focus on being the salt. Would you pray with me? Father, I thank you for Jesus. I thank you for his love, for sending him to die in our place. Lord, that we live in a world that is spiritually dead, and the evidence of that is clear around us. It's easy to see. And it may cause us at times to doubt and to despair and to worry and to wonder where you are. But we know that the answer is in us. It's you. And you're sprinkling and spreading us around to be an influence, to just have a presence, a touch on the world and the people around us, so that people would see you. They would find their hope in you, that they would come to know you, to put their faith in you. And they too would be the salt of the earth. So help us to see, God, our purpose in the different places that you have us, in our homes, in our workplaces, in our schools, in our families, in our friendships, in all those places, God. We are salt. Help us to realize the importance of what that means and how you're using us. We thank you that you love us enough to include us. It's in Jesus' name that I pray. Amen.